The evolution of the British Empire into the Commonwealth of Nations is to a very great extent the result of the activities of the Milner Group. To be sure, the ultimate goal of the group was quite different from the present system, since they wanted a federation of the empire, but this was a long-run goal, and en route they accepted the present system as a temporary way station. However, the strength of colonial and dominion feeling, which made the ideal of federation admittedly remote at all times, has succeeded in making this way station a permanent terminal and thus had eliminated, apparently forever, the hope for federation. With the exception of a few diehards of whom Milner and Curtis were the leaders, the group has accepted the solution of imperial cooperation and parallelism as an alternative to federation. This was definitely stated in the Round Table of December 1920. In that issue the group adopted the path of cooperation as its future policy and added, "It's the Round Table's promoters in this country feel bound to state that all the experience of the war and of the peace has not shaken in the least the fundamental conviction with which they commenced the publication of this review." The Round Table has never expressed an opinion as to the form which this constitutional organization would take, nor as to the time when it should be undertaken. But it has never disguised its conviction that a cooperate system would eventually break down. In September 1935, in a review of its first 25 years, the journal stated, "Since the war, therefore, though it has never abandoned its view that the only final basis for freedom and enduring peace is the organic union of nations in a commonwealth embracing the whole world, or, in the first instance, the lesser part of it, the Round Table has been a consistent supporter of the principles upon which the British Empire now rests, as set forth in the Balfour Memorandum of 1926. It has felt that only by trying the cooperation method to the utmost and realizing its limitations in practice would nations within or without the British Empire be brought to face the necessity for organic union. There apparently exists within the Milner Group a myth to the effect that they invented the expression Commonwealth of Nations, that it was derived from Zimmern's book The Greek Commonwealth, published in 1911 and first appeared in public in the title of Curtis's book in 1916. This is not quite accurate, for the older imperialists of the Cecil bloc had used the term Commonwealth in reference to the British Empire on various occasions as early as 1884. In that year, in a speech at Adelaide, Australia, Lord Rosebery referred to the possibility of New Zealand seceding from the Empire and added, "God forbid. There is no need for any nation, however great, leaving the Empire, because the Empire is a commonwealth of nations." If the Milner Group did not invent the term, they gave it a very definite and special meaning, based on Zimmern's book, and they popularized the use of the expression. According to Zimmern, the expression Commonwealth referred to a community based on freedom and the rule of law, in distinction to a government based on authority or even arbitrary tyranny. The distinction was worked out in Zimmern's book in the contrast between Athens, as described in Pericles' funeral oration, and Sparta for the actual conduct of the Athenian Empire. As applied to the modern world, the contrast was between the British government, as described by Dicey, and the despotisms of Philip II, Wilhelm II, and Nicholas II. In this sense of the word, Commonwealth was not originally an alternative to federation, as it later became, since it referred to the moral qualities of government, and these could exist within either a federated or a non-federated empire. The expression British Commonwealth of Nations was, then, not invented by the group but was given a very special meaning and was propagated in this sense until it finally became common usage. The first step in this direction was taken on May 15, 1917, when General Smuts, at a banquet in his honour in the Houses of Parliament, used the expression. This banquet was apparently arranged by the Milner Group, and Lord Milner sat at Smuts's right hand during the speech. The speech itself was printed and given the widest publicity, being disseminated throughout Great Britain, the Commonwealth, the United States, and the rest of the world. In retrospect, some persons have believed that Smuts was rejecting the meaning of the expression as used by the Milner Group, because he did reject the project for imperial federation in this speech. This, however, is a mistake, for, as we have said, the expression Commonwealth at that time had a meaning which could include either federation or cooperation among the members of the British imperial system. The antithesis in meaning between federation and Commonwealth is a later development which took place outside the group. To this day, men like Curtis, Amory, and Grigg still use the term Commonwealth as applied to a federated empire, and they always define the word Commonwealth as a government of liberty under the law and not as an arrangement of independent but cooperating states. The development of the British Empire into the Commonwealth of Nations and a role which the Milner Group played in this development cannot be understood by anyone who feels that federation and Commonwealth were mutually exclusive ideas. In fact, there were not two ideas, but three, and they were not regarded by the group as substitutes for each other but as supplements to each other. These three ideas were: 1. The creation of a common ideology and world outlook among the peoples of the United Kingdom, the Empire, and the United States. 2. The creation of instruments and practices of cooperation among these various communities in order that they might pursue parallel policies. And 3. The creation of a federation on an imperial, Anglo-American, or world basis. The Milner Group regarded these as supplementary to one another and worked vigorously for all of them, without believing that they were mutually exclusive alternatives. They always realized, even the most fanatical of them, that federation, even of the empire only, was very remote. They always, in this connection, used such expressions as "not in our lifetime" or "not in the present century." They always insisted that the basic unity of any system must rest on common ideology, and they worked in this direction through the Rhodes Scholarships, the Round Table Groups, and the Institutes of International Affairs. even when they were most ardently seeking to create organized constitutional relationships. And in these constitutional relationships they worked equally energetically and simultaneously for imperial federation and for such instruments of cooperation as conferences of prime ministers of dominions. The idea, which seems to have gained currency, that the Round Table Group was solely committed to federation and that the failure of this project marked the defeat and eclipse of the group is erroneous. On the contrary, by the 1930s, the Round Table Group was working so strongly for a common ideology and for institutions of cooperation that many believers in federation regarded them as defeatist. For this reason, some believers in federation organized a new movement called the World Commonwealth Movement. Evidence of this movement is an article by Lord Davies in the 19th Century and After for January 1935, called Round Table or World Commonwealth. This new movement was critical of the foreign policy rather than the imperial policy of the Round Table Group, especially its policy of appeasement toward Germany and of weakening the League of Nations, and its belief that Britain could find security in isolation from the continent and a balance of power policy. Supported by the United Kingdom, the Dominions, and the United States. The effort of the Round Table Group to create a common ideology to unite the supporters of the British way of life appears in every aspect of their work. It was derived from Rhodes and Milner and found its most perfect manifestation in the Rhodes scholarships. As a result of these and of the Milner Group's control of so much of Oxford tended to become an international university. Here the Milner Group had to tread a narrow path between the necessity of training non-English including Americans and Indians in the English way of life and the possibility of submerging that way of life completely at Oxford, at least by admitting too many non-English to its cloistered halls. On the whole, this path was followed with considerable success, as will be realized by anyone who has had any experience with Rhodes scholars. To be sure, the visitors from across the seas picked up the social customs of the English somewhat more readily than they did the English ideas of playing the game or the English ideas of politics, but, on the whole, the experiment of Rhodes, Milner, and Lothian cannot be called the failure. It was surely a greater success in the United States than it was in the Dominions or in India, for in the last, at least, the English idea of liberty was assimilated much more completely than the idea of loyalty to England. The efforts of the Milner Group to encourage federation of the empire have already been indicated. They failed and, indeed, were bound to fail, as most members of the group soon realized. As early as 1903, John Butkin and Joseph Chamberlain had given up the attempt. By 1917, even Curtis had accepted the idea that federation was a very remote possibility, although in his case, at least, it remained as the beckoning will-o'-the wisp by which all lesser goals were measured and found vaguely dissatisfying to help the third string to the bow. Imperial cooperation remained. It became in time the chief concern of the group. The story of these efforts is a familiar one, and no attempt will be made here to repeat it. We are concerned only with a role played by the Milner Group in these efforts. In general, this role was very large, if not decisive. The proposals for imperial cooperation had as their basic principle the assumption that communities which had a common ideology could pursue parallel courses toward the same goal merely by consultation among their leaders. For a long time, the Milner Group did not see that the greater the degree of success obtained by this method, the more remote was the possibility that federation could ever be attained. It is very likely that the group was misled in this by the fact that they were for many years extremely fortunate in keeping members of the group in positions of power and influence in the Dominions. As long as men like Smuts, Botha, who did what Smuts wanted, Duncan, Feetham, or Long were in influential positions in South Africa, as long as men like Eggleston, Bavin, or Dudley Braham were influential in Australia, as long as men like Glazebrook, Massey, Joseph Flavell, or Percy Corbett were influential in Canada. In a nutshell, as long as members of the Milner Group were influential throughout the Dominions, the technique of the parallel policy of cooperation would be the easiest way to reach the common goal. Unfortunately, this was not the method that could be expected to continue forever, and when the Milner Group grew older and weaker, it could not be expected that their newer recruits in England like Hodgson, Coupland, Actor, Woodward, Elton, and others could continue to work on a parallel policy with the newer arrivals to power in the Dominions. When that unhappy day arrived, the Milner Group should have had institutionalized modes of procedure firmly established. They did not because they did not want them, but because their members in the Dominions could not have remained in influential positions if they had insisted on creating institutionalized links with Britain when the people of the Dominions obviously did not want such links. The use of colonial or imperial conferences as a method for establishing closer contact with the various parts of the empire was originally established by the Cecil Block and taken over by the Milner Group. The first for such conferences in 1887, 1897, 1902, and 1907 were largely dominated by the former group, although they were not technically in power during the last one. The decisive changes made in the colonial conference system at the conference of 1907 were worked out by a secret group, which consulted on the plans for 18 months and presented them to the Royal Colonial Institute in April 1905. These plans were embodied in a dispatch from the Colonial Secretary, Alfred Lyttelton, and carried out at the conference of 1907. As a result, it was established that the name of the meeting was to be changed to Imperial Conference. It was to be called into session every 4 years. It was to consist of prime ministers of the self-governing parts of the empire. The colonial secretary was to be eliminated from the picture, and a new Dominion Department, under Sir Charles Lucas, was to be set up in the Colonial Office. As the future Lord Lothian wrote in the Round Table in 1911, The final result was to destroy the hopes for federation by recognizing the separate existence of the dominions. At the Conference of 1907, at the suggestion of Haldane, there was created a Committee of Imperial Defense, and a plan was adopted to organize Dominion defense forces on similar patterns, so that they could be integrated in an emergency. The second of these proposals, which led to a complete reorganization of the armies of New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa in 1909 to 1912, with very beneficial results in the crisis of 1914 to 1918, is not of immediate concern to us. The Committee of Imperial Defence and its secretarial staff were creations of Lord Esher, who had been chairman of a special committee to reform the War Office in 1903 and was permanent member of the Committee of Imperial Defence from 1905 to his death. As a result of his influence, the secretariat of this committee became a branch of the Milner Group and later became the secretariat of the cabinet itself, when that body first obtained a secretariat in 1917. From this secretarial staff the Milner Group obtained 3 recruits in the period after 1918. These were Maurice Hankey, Ernest Swinton, and W.G.A. Ormsby Gord, now Lord Harlech. Hankey was Assistant Secretary of the Committee of Imperial Defence from 1908 to 1912 and was Secretary from 1912 to 1938. Swinton was Assistant Secretary from 1917 to 1925. Both became members of the Milner Group, Hankey close to the inner circle, Swinton in one of the less central rings. Ormsby Gord was an Assistant Secretary in 1917 to 1918 at the same time that he was Private Secretary to Lord Milner. All 3 of these men are of sufficient importance to justify a closer examination of their careers. Maurice Pascal Ehlers Hankey Sir Maurice after 1916, Baron Hankey since 1939, whose family was related by marriage to the Wyndhams, was born in 1877 and joined the Royal Marines when he graduated from Rugby in 1895. He retired from that service in 1918 as a lieutenant colonel and was raised to colonel on the retired list in 1929. He was attached for duty with the Naval Intelligence Department in 1902 and by this route reached the staff of the Committee of Imperial Defence 6 years later. In 1917, when it was decided to give the Cabinet a Secretariat for the first time, and to create the Imperial War Cabinet by adding overseas representatives to the British War Cabinet, a change in which Milner played the chief role, the Secretariat of the Committee of Imperial Defence became also the Secretariat of the other 2 bodies. At the same time, as we have seen, the Prime Minister was given a secretariat consisting of 2 members of the Milner Group, Carroll and Adams. In this way Hankey became Secretary and Swinton Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet, the former holding that post, along with a parallel post in the Committee of Imperial Defence, until 1938. It was undoubtedly through Hankey and the Milner Group that Swinton became Chucheley Professor of Military History and a Fellow of All Souls in 1925. As for Hankey himself, he became one of the more significant figures in the Milner Group, close to the inner circle and one of the most important although relatively little-known figures in British history of recent times. He was Clerk of the Privy Council in 1923 to 1938. He was Secretary to the British delegation at the Peace Conference of 1919, at the Washington Conference of 1921, at the Genoa Conference of 1922, and at the London Reparations Conference of 1924. He was Secretary-General of the Hague Conference of 1929 to 1930, of the London Naval Conference of 1930, and of the Lausanne Conference of 1932. He was Secretary-General of the British Imperial Conferences of 1921, 1923, 1926, 1930, and 1937. He retired in 1938, but became a member of the Permanent Mandates Commission succeeding Lord Hailey in 1939. He was British Government Director of the Suez Canal Company in 1938 to 1939, Minister without portfolio in 1939 to 1940, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster in 1940 to 1941, Paymaster General in 1941 to 1942, Chairman of the Scientific Advisory Committee and of the Engineering Advisory Committee in 1942 to 1943. At the present time he is a Director of the Suez Canal Company since 1945, Chairman of the Technical Personnel Committee since 1941, Chairman of the Interdepartmental Committee on Further Education and Training and of the Committee on Higher Appointments in the Civil Service since 1944 and Chairman of the Colonial Products Research Committee since 1942. Hankey, in 1903, married Adeline D. Smith, daughter of a well-known South African political figure. His oldest son, Robert, is now the first secretary in the diplomatic service, while his daughter, Ursula, has been married since 1929 to John A. Bent, Chairman of the Board of Bent Brothers, Publishers. Hankey was Lord Esher's chief protégé in the Milner Group and in British public life. They were in constant communication with one another, and Esher gave Hankey a constant stream of advice about his conduct in his various official positions. The following scattered examples can be gleaned from the published journals and letters of Reginald, Viscount Esher. On February 18, 1919, Esher wrote Hankey, advising him not to accept the position as Secretary-General of the League of Nations. On December 7, 1919, he gave him detailed advice on how to conduct himself as Secretary to the Conference of Dominion Prime Ministers, telling him to work for a League of Empire based on cooperation and not on any rigid constitutional plan, to try to get an Imperial General Staff, and to use the Defense Committee as such a staff in the meantime. In 1929, when Ramsay MacDonald tried to exclude Hankey from a secret cabinet meeting, Esher went so far in support of his protégé as to write a letter of admonition to the Prime Minister. This letter, dated July 21, 1929, said, "What is this I see quoted from a London paper that you are excluding your secretary from cabinet meetings? It probably is untrue, for you are the last person in the world to take a retrograde step toward secrecy, whether in diplomacy or government. The evolution of our cabinet system from cabal has been slow but sure. When the secretary to the cabinet became an established factor in conducting business, almost the last traces of mumbo-jumbo, cherished from the days when Bolingbroke was a danger to public peace, disappeared. Hankey was succeeded as Secretary of the Cabinet in 1938 by Edward E. Bridges, who has been close to the Milner Group since he became a Fellow of All Souls in 1920. Bridges, son of the late poet laureate Robert Bridges, had the advantages of a good education at Eton and Magdalen. He was a Treasury civil servant from 1919, was knighted in 1939, and since 1945 has combined with his cabinet position the exalted post of Permanent Secretary of the Treasury and head of His Majesty's Civil Service. The Imperial Conference of 191 has little concern with our story, although Asquith's opening speech could have been written in the office of the Round Table. Indeed, it is quoted with approval by Lionel Curtis in his The Problem of the Commonwealth, published 5 years later. Asquith pointed out that the empire rested on 3 foundations: A. The reign of law, in diocese sense; B. Local autonomy; and C. Trusteeship of the interests and fortunes of fellow subjects who have not yet attained to the full stature of self-government. He then pointed out the 2 principles of centralization and disintegration which had applied to the empire in the early Victorian period, and declared, "Neither of these theories commands the faintest support today, either at home or in any part of our self-governing empire. Whether in this United Kingdom or in any one of the great communities which you represent, we each of us are, and we each of us intend to remain, master in our own household. This is, here at home and throughout the dominions, the life-blood of our polity." Thus spoke Asquith, and even the ultra-federalist Curtis approved. He also approved when Asquith squelched Sir John Ward's suggestion for the creation of an imperial council, although doubtless from quite a different motivation. At the conference of 1911, as is well known, the overseas members were for the first time initiated into the mysteries of high policy, because of the menace of Germany. Except for this, which paid high dividends in 1914, the conference was largely wasted motion. The conference of 1915 was not held, because of the war, but as soon as Milner came into the government in December 1915, the Round Table's argument that the war should be used as a means for consolidating the empire, rather than as an excuse for postponing consolidation, began to take effect. The Round Table during 1915 was agitating for an immediate imperial conference with Indian participation for the first time. As soon as Milner joined the cabinet in December 1915, he sent out cables to the Dominions and to India, inviting them to come. It was Milner also who created the Imperial War Cabinet by adding Dominion members to the British War Cabinet. These developments were foretold and approved by the Round Table. In its June 1917 issue it said, "In the course of a long article on new developments in the Constitution of the Empire at a date which cannot be far distant, an Imperial Conference will assemble, the purpose of which will be to consider what further steps can be taken to transform the empire of a state in which the main responsibilities and burdens of its common affairs are sustained and controlled by the United Kingdom into a commonwealth of equal nations conducting its foreign policy and common affairs by some method of continuous consultation and concerted action." The decision today is against any federated reconstruction after the war. It is evident, however, that the institution through which the improved imperial system will chiefly work will be the newly constituted Imperial Cabinet. The Imperial Cabinet will be different in some important respects from the Imperial Conference. It will meet annually instead of once in 4 years. It will be concerned more particularly with foreign policy, which the Imperial Conference has never yet discussed. Its proceedings will consequently be secret. It will also consist of the most important British ministers sitting in conclave with the overseas ministers instead of the Secretary of State for the colonies alone, as has been usually the case hitherto. As is well known, the Imperial War Cabinet met 14 times in 1917, met again in 1918, and assembled at Paris in 1918 to 1919 as the British Empire delegation to the Peace Conference. Parallel with it, the Imperial War Conference met in London in 1917, under the Colonial Secretary, to discuss non-war problems. At the meetings of the former body it was decided to hold annual meetings in the future and to invite the Dominions to establish resident ministers in London to ensure constant consultation. At a meeting in 1917 was drawn up the famous Imperial Resolution, which excluded federation as a solution of the imperial problem and recognized the complete equality of the Dominions and the United Kingdom under one king. These developments were not only acceptable to Milner but apparently were largely engineered by him. On July 9, 1919, he issued a formal statement containing the sentences, "The only possibility of a continuance of the British Empire is on a basis of absolute out-and-out equal partnership between the United Kingdom and the Dominions. I say that without any kind of reservation whatever." When Milner died, in May 1925, the Times obituary had this to say about this portion of his life. With the special meeting of the War Cabinet attended by the Dominion Prime Ministers which, beginning on March 20, came to be distinguished as the Imperial War Cabinet. Milner was more closely concerned than any other British statesman. The conception of the Imperial War Cabinet and the actual proposal to bring the Dominion premiers into the United Kingdom Cabinet were his. And when, thanks to Mr. Lloyd George's ready acceptance of the proposal, Milner's conception was realized, it proved to be not only a solution of the problem of imperial administrative unity in its then transient but most urgent phase, but a permanent and far-reaching advance in the constitutional evolution of the empire. It met again in 1918, and was continued as the British Empire delegation in the peace negotiations at Versailles in 1919. Thus, at the moment of its greatest need, the empire was furnished by Milner with a common executive. For the Imperial War Cabinet could and did take executive action, and its decisions bound the empire at large. 3. It was also Milner who insisted on and made the arrangements for the Imperial Conference of 1921, acting in his capacity as colonial secretary, although he was forced, by reason of poor health, to resign before the conference assembled. It was in this period as colonial secretary that Milner, assisted by Amory, set up the plans for the new hierarchic constitution for Malta, gave Egypt its full freedom, set Curtis to work on the Irish problem, and gave Canada permission to establish its own legation in the United States. The latter post filled only in 1926, and then by the son-in-law of Milner's closest collaborator in the Rhodes Trust. The Imperial Conferences of 1921 and 1923 were largely in the control of the Cecil Bloc, at least so far as the United Kingdom delegation was concerned. 3 of the 5 members of this delegation in 1921 were from this bloc: Balfour, Curzon, and Austen Chamberlain, the other 2 being Lloyd George and Winston Churchill. Of the members of the other 5 delegations, only Smuts, from South Africa, is of significance to us. On the secretarial staff for the United Kingdom delegation, we might point out the presence of Hankey and Grigg. In the Imperial Conference of 1923 we find a similar situation. 3 of the 4 delegates from the United Kingdom were of the Cecil Bloc: Lord Salisbury, Curzon, and the Duke of Devonshire, the other being Prime Minister Baldwin. Smuts again led the South African delegation. The secretarial staff was headed by Hankey, while the separate Indian secretarial group was led by L. F. Rushbrook Williams. The latter, whom we have already mentioned, had been associated with the Milner Group since he was elected a Fellow of All Souls in 1914, had done special work in preparation of the Government of India Act of 1919, and worked under Madras in applying that act after it became law. His later career carried him to various parts of the Milner Group's extensive system, as can be seen from the fact that he was a delegate to the Assembly of the League of Nations in 1925, Foreign Minister of Pachela State in 1925 to 1931, a member of the Indian Round Table Conference in 1920 to 1932, the significant figure in the British Broadcasting Corporation and the Ministry of Information in delegation. There is nothing to indicate that Mr. Latham, later Sir John, was a member of the Milner Group, but in later years his son, Richard, clearly was. Sir John had apparently made his first contact with the Milner Group in 1919, when he, a professor of law at the University of Melbourne, was a member of the staff of the Australian delegation to the Paris Peace Conference and, while there, became an assistant secretary to the British delegation. In 1922, at the age of 45, he began a 12-year term as an Australian MP. During that brief period he was Attorney General in 1925 to 1929, Minister of Industry in 1928 to 1929, Leader of the Opposition in 1929 to 1931, Deputy Leader of the Majority in 1931 to 1932, and Deputy Prime Minister, Attorney General, and Minister for Industry in 1932 to 1934. In addition, he was British Secretary to the Allied Commission on Czechoslovak Affairs in 1919, first President of the League of Nations Union, Australian delegate to the League of Nations in 1926 and 1932, Australian representative to the World Disarmament Conference in 1932, Chancellor of the University of Melbourne in 1939 to 1941, Australian Minister of Japan in 1940 to 1941, and Vice President of the period 1932 to 1944, and is now a member of the editorial staff of The Times. At these two conferences, various members of the Cecil Bloch and Milner Group were called in for consultation on matters within their competence. Of these persons, we might mention the names of H. A. L. Fisher, Sir R. Crome, Sir Cecil Hurst, Robert Cecil, Leopold Amory, Samuel Hoare, and Sir Fabian Ware of the kindergarten. The Imperial Conference of 1926 is generally recognized as one of the most important of the post-war period. The Cecil Bloch and Milner Group again had 3 out of 5 members of the United Kingdom delegation: Balfour, Austin Chamberlain, and Leopold Amory, with Baldwin and Churchill the other 2. Hankey was, as usual, secretary of the conference. Of the other 7 delegations, nothing is germane to our investigation except that Vincent Massey was an advisor to the Canadian, and John Quigley was a member of the Australian Red Cross in 1944. Since 1934, he has been Chief Justice of Australia. In this brilliant, if belated, career, Sir John came into contact with the Milner Group, and this undoubtedly assisted his son, Richard, in his more precocious career. Richard Latham was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford until 1933 and a Fellow of All Souls from 1935. He wrote the supplementary legal chapter in W. K. Hancock's Survey of British Commonwealth Affairs and was one of the chief advisers of K. C. Ware in his famous book, The Statute of Westminster and Dominion Status 1938. Unfortunately, Richard Latham died a few years later while still in his middle 30s. It is clear from Professor Ware's book that Sir John Latham, although a member of the opposition at the time, was one of the chief figures in Australia's acceptance of the Statute of Westminster. The new status of the Dominions, as enunciated in the report of the conference and later known as the Balfour Declaration, was accepted by the Milner Group both in the Round Table and in the Times. In the latter, on November 22, 1926, Readers were informed that the declaration merely described the empire as it was, with nothing really new except the removal of a few anachronisms. It concluded, "In all its various clauses there is hardly a statement or a definition which does not coincide with familiar practice." The Imperial Conference of 1930 was conducted by a Labour government and had no members of the Cecil Block or Milner Group among its chief delegates. Sir Maurice Hankey, however, was secretary of the conference, and among its chief advisers were Maurice G.W. Weir and H.D. Henderson. Both of these were members of All Souls and probably close to the Milner Group. The Imperial Conference of 1937 was held during the period in which the Milner Group was at the peak of its power. Of the 8 members of the United Kingdom delegation, 5 were from the Milner Group: Lord Halifax, Sir John Simon, Malcolm MacDonald, W.G.A. Ormsby Gort, and Sir Samuel Hoare. The others were Baldwin, Neville Chamberlain, and J. Ramsay MacDonald. In addition, the chief of the Indian delegation was the Marquess of Zelland of the Cecil Block. Sir Maurice Hankey was secretary of the conference, and among the advisers were Sir Donald Somerville of All Souls and the Milner Group, Vincent Massey, Sir Fabian Ware, and the Marquess of Hartington. In addition to the Imperial Conferences, where the influence of the Milner Group was probably more extensive than appears from the membership of the delegations, the group was influential in the administration of the Commonwealth, especially in the 2 periods of its greatest power, from 1924 to 1929 and from 1935 to 1939. An indication of this can be seen in the fact that the office of Colonial Secretary was held by the group for 7 out often years from 1919 to 1929 and for 5 out of 9 years from 1931 to 1940, while the office of Dominion Secretary was held by a member of the group for 8 out of the 14 years from its creation in 1925 to the outbreak of the war in 1939, although the Labour Party was in power for 2 of those years. The colonial secretaries to whom we have reference were Lord Milner, 1919 to 1921; Leopold Amery, 1924 to 1929; Malcolm MacDonald, 1935; W.G.A. Ormsby Gort, 1936 to 1938; Malcolm MacDonald, 1938 to 1940. The Dominion secretaries to whom we have reference were Amery, 1925 to 1929; Malcolm MacDonald, 1935 to 1938, 1938 to 1939. The lesser positions within the Colonial Office were not remote from the Milner Group. The permanent Under-Secretary was Sir George Fittis of the Kindergarten in 1916 to 1921. In addition, James Masterton Smith, who had been Balfour's private secretary previously, was permanent Under-Secretary in succession to Fittis in 1921 to 1925, and John Matthey, who had been Lord Chelmsford's secretary while the latter was Viceroy in 1916 to 1921, was permanent Under-Secretary from 1933 to 1937. The position of Parliamentary Under-Secretary, which had been held by Lord Selborne in 1895 to 1900 and by Sir Arthur Steele Maitland in 1915 to 1917, was held by Amory in 1919 to 1921, by Edward Wood Lord Halifax in 1921 to 1922, by Ormsby Gort in 1922 to 1924, 1924 to 1929, and by Lord Dufferin, brother of Lord Blackwood of the Kindergarten from 1937 to 1940. Most of these persons, probably all except Master Smith, Matthew, and Lord Dufferin, were members of the Milner Group. The most important, of course, was Leopold Amory, whom we have already shown as Milner's chief political protégé. We have not yet indicated that Malcolm MacDonald was a member of the Milner Group, and must be satisfied at this point with saying that he was a member, or at least an instrument, of the group, from 1931 or 1932 onward, without ever becoming a member of the inner circle. The evidence indicating this relationship will be discussed later. At this point we should say a few words about W.G.A. Ormsby Gort, Lord Harlech since 1938, who was a member of the Cecil block by marriage and of the Milner Group by adoption. A graduate of Eton in 1930, he went to New College as a contemporary of Philip Carroll and Reginald Coupland. He took his degree in 1908 and was made a Fellow of New College in 1936. A Conservative Member of Parliament from 1910 until he went to the Upper House in 1938, he spent the early years of the First World War in military intelligence, chiefly in Egypt. In 1913 he married Lady Beatrice Cecil, daughter of the 4th Marquess of Salisbury, and 4 years later became Parliamentary Private Secretary to Lord Milner as well as Assistant Secretary to the War Cabinet, associated in the latter post with Hankey, Carroll, W.G.S. Adams, and Amory of the Milner Group. Ormsby Gort went on a mission to Palestine in 1918 and was with the British delegation at the Paris Peace Conference as an expert on the Middle East. He was Under-Secretary for the Colonies with the Duke of Devonshire in 1922 to 1924 and with Leopold Amory in 1924 to 1929. Becoming Colonial Secretary in his own right in 1936 to 1938. In the interval he was Postmaster General in 1931 and First Commissioner of Works in 1931 to 1936. He was a member of the Permanent Mandates Commission 1921 to 1923 and of the Colonial Office Mission to the British West Indies 1921 to 1922, and was chairman of the East African Parliamentary Commission in 1924. He was High Commissioner of South Africa and the 3 native protectorates in 1941 to 1944. He has been a director of the Midland Bank and of the Standard Bank of South Africa. He was also one of the founders of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, a member of Lord Lothian's Committee on the African Survey, and a member of the Council of the Institute. The Milner Group also influenced Commonwealth affairs by publicity work of great quantity and good quality. This was done through the various periodicals controlled by the group, such as the Round Table, the Times, International Affairs and others, by books published by the Royal Institute of International Affairs and individual members of the group, by academic and university activities by men like Professor Coupland, Professor Smyrn, Professor Harlow, and others, by public and private discussion meetings sponsored by the Round Table groups throughout the Commonwealth, by the Institute of International Affairs everywhere, by the Institute of Pacific Relations IPR, by the Council on Foreign Relations, by the Williamstown Institute of Politics, by the Rhodes Scholarship Group, and through the three unofficial conferences on British Commonwealth relations held by the group since 1933. Some of these organizations and activities have already been mentioned. The last will be discussed here. The rest are to be described in Chapter 10. The three unofficial conferences on British Commonwealth relations were held at Toronto in 1933, at Sydney in 1938, and at London in 1945. They were initiated and controlled by the Milner Group, acting through the various institutes of international affairs, in the hope that they would contribute to the closer union of the Commonwealth by inclining the opinion of prominent persons in the Dominions in that direction. The plan was originated by the British Empire members of the Institute of Pacific Relations at the Kyoto meeting in 1929. The members from Great Britain consisted of Lord Robert Cecil, Sir Herbert Samuel, Sir Donald Somerville, Sir John Power, P.J. Noel Baker, G.M. Gawthorne Hardy, H.V. Hodgson, H.W. Kerr, A.J. Toynbee, J.W. Wheeler Bennett, and A.E. Smyrn. Of these, 2 were from the Cecil block and 5 from the Milner Group. Discussion was continued at the Shanghai meeting of the Institute of Pacific Relations in 1931, and a committee under Robert Cecil drew up an agenda for the unofficial conference. This committee made the final arrangements at a meeting in Chatham House in July 1932 and published as a preliminary work a volume called Consultation and Cooperation in the British Commonwealth. The conference was held at the University of Toronto, 11 to 21 September 1933. With 43 delegates and 33 secretaries, the travelling expenses being covered by a grant from the Carnegie Corporation. The United Kingdom delegation consisted of the 11 names mentioned above plus R.C. M. Arnold as private secretary to Lord Cecil and J.P. Maclean the famous shipbuilder as private secretary to Sir Herbert Samuel. The Australian delegation of 6 included Professor A. H. Charteris, Professor Ernest Scott, A. Smithy the Rhodes Scholar of 1929, Alfred Stirling and Oxford B.A., W. J. V. Winnie Eater, and Richard Latham the Rhodes Scholar of 1933. The Canadian delegation consisted of N. W. Rowell, Sir Robert Borden, Lewis Coate, John W. Dafoe, Sir Robert Falconer, Sir Joseph Flavell, W. Sanford Evans, Vincent Massey, Renee L. Moran, J. S. Woodsworth, W. M. Burks, Charles J. Burchell, Brooke Claxton, Percy E. Corbett, W. P. M. Kennedy, J. J. MacDonald Rhodes Trustee for Canada, and E. J. Tarr. The secretary to the delegation was George Parkin Glazebrook Balliol 1924. Most of these names are significant, but we need only point out that at least 4 of them, including the secretary, were members of the Milner Group: Massey, Corbett, Flavel, Glazebrook. The New Zealand delegation had 3 members, one of which was W. Downey Stewart, and the South African delegation had 5 members, including F. S. Mallon and Professor Eric A. Walker. The Secretariat to the whole conference was headed by I. F. McAdam of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. The Secretary to the United Kingdom delegation was H. V. Hobson. Thus it would appear that the Milner Group had 8 out of 43 delegates, as well as the secretaries to the Canadian and United Kingdom delegations. The conference was divided into 4 commissions, each of which had a chairman and a rapporteur. In addition, the first Commission on Foreign Policy was subdivided into 2 subcommittees. The chairmen of the 4 commissions were Robert Cecil, Vincent Massey, F. S. Mallon, and W. Downey Stewart. Thus the Milner Group had 2 out of 4. The rapporteurs including the 2 subcommittees were A. Ellesmere, H. V. Hobson, P. E. Corbett, E. A. Walker, P. J. Noel Baker, D. B. Somerville, and A. H. Charteris. Thus the Milner Group had 4 out of 7 and possibly more, as Walker may be a member of the group. The discussions at the conference were secret. The press was excluded, and in the published proceedings, edited by A. J. Toynbee, all remarks were presented in indirect discourse and considerably curtailed, without identification of the speakers. The conference made a number of recommendations, including the following: 1. Dominion High Commissioners in London should be given diplomatic status with direct access to the Foreign Office. 2. Junior members of Dominion Foreign Offices should receive a period of training in the Foreign Office in London. 3. Diplomatic representatives should be exchanged between dominions. 4. Commonwealth tribunals should be set up to settle legal disputes between dominions. 5. Collective security and the League of Nations should be supported. 6. Cooperation with the United States was advocated. The second unofficial conference on British Commonwealth relations was held near Sydney, Australia, 3–17 September 1938. The expenses were met by grants from the Carnegie Corporation and the Rhodes Trustees. The decision to hold the second conference was made by the British members at the Yosemite meeting of the Institute of Pacific Relations in 1936. A committee under Viscount Sagnell met at Chatham House in June 1937 and drew up the arrangements and the agenda. The selection of delegates was left to the various institutes of international affairs. From the United Kingdom went Lord Lothian Chairman, Lionel Curtis, W. K. Hancock, Hugh A. Wyndham, A. Ellesmere, Norman Bentwich, Ernest Bevan, V. A. Cazalet, A. M. Fraser, Sir John Burnet Stewart, Miss Grace Haddo, Sir Howard Carey, Sir Frederick Minter, Sir John Pratt, and James Walker. At least 5 out of 15, including the chairman, were of the Milner Group. From Australia came 31 members, including T.R. Bevan, chairman of the delegation, K.H. Bailey, the Rhodes Scholar, and A.H. Charteris. From Canada came 15, including E.J. Tarr, chairman of the delegation, and P.E. Corbett. From India came 4 Indians. From Ireland came 5 persons. From New Zealand came 14, with W. Downey Stewart as chairman. From South Africa came 6, including P. van der Bijl, chairman, and G.R. Hoffenheer, an old associate of the Milner Kindergarten in the Transvaal. Of 90 delegates, 9 were members of the Milner Group and 3 others may have been. This is a small proportion, but the conduct of the conference was well controlled. The chairmen of the 3 most important delegations were of the Milner Group: Eggleston, Doughty, Stewart, and Lothian. The chairman of the conference itself, Bevan, was. The secretary of the conference was McAdam. The recorder was Hodgson, and the secretary to the press committee was Lionel Vincent Massey, grandson of George Parkin. The proceedings of the conference were edited by Hodgson, with an introduction by Bevan, and published by the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Again, no indication was given of who said what. The third unofficial conference on British Commonwealth relations was similar to the others, although the war emergency restricted its membership to persons who were already in London. As background material it prepared 62 books and papers, of which many are now published. Among these was World War, Its Cause and Cure by Lionel Curtis. The Committee on Arrangements and Agenda, with Lord Astor as chairman, met in New York in January 1944. The delegations outside the United Kingdom were made up of persons doing war duty in London, with a liberal mixture of Dominion Rhodes Scholars. The chairmen of the various delegations included Professor K. H. Bailey from Australia, E. J. Tarr from Canada, Sir Sardar E. Singh from India, W. P. Morrell, whom we have already seen as a Bite lecturer, the Rhodes Scholar, and a co-editor with the Reverend K. Bell of All Souls, Professor S. H. Frankel from South Africa, and Lord Haley from the United Kingdom. There were also observers from Burma and Southern Rhodesia. Of the 53 delegates, 16 were from the United Kingdom. Among these were Lord Haley, Lionel Curtis, V. T. Harlow, Sir Frederick White, A. G. B. Fisher, John Coatman, Miss Kathleen Courtney, Viscount Hinchingbroke, K. Creech Jones, Sir Walter Layton, Sir Henry Price, Miss Heather Harvey, and others. Of the total of 53 members, no more than 5 or 6 were of the Milner Group. The opening speech to the conference was made by Lord Robert Cecil, and the proceedings were published in the usual form under the editorship of Robert Frost, Research Secretary of the Royal Institute of International Affairs and author of the Imperial sections of the History of the Times. In all the various activities of the Milner Group in respect to Commonwealth affairs, it is possible to discern a dualistic attitude. This attitude reveals a wholehearted public acceptance of the existing constitutional and political relationships of Great Britain and the Dominions, combined with an intense secret yearning for some form of closer union. The realization that closer union was not politically feasible in a democratic age in which the majority of persons, especially in the Dominions, rejected any effort to bind the various parts of the empire together explains this dualism. The members of the group, as the Round Table pointed out in 1919, were not convinced of the effectiveness or workability of any program of Dominion relations based solely on cooperation without any institutional basis. But publicly, and in the next breath, the group wholeheartedly embraced all the developments that destroyed one by one the legal and institutional links which bound the Dominions to the mother country. In one special field after another, in defense, economic cooperation, raw materials conservation, war grapes, intellectual cooperation, health measures, etc., etc. The group eagerly welcomed efforts to create new institutional links between the self-governing portions of the Commonwealth. But all the time the group recognized that these innovations were unable to satisfy a yearning that burned in the group's collective heart. Only as the Second World War began to enter its second, and more hopeful, half, did the group begin once again to raise its voice with suggestions for some more permanent organization of the constitutional side of Commonwealth relations. All of these suggestions were offered in a timid and tentative fashion, more or less publicly labeled as trial balloons and usually prefaced by an engaging statement that the suggestion was the result of the personal and highly imperfect ideas of the speaker himself. Thinking aloud, as Smuts called it, became epidemic among the members of the group. These idle thoughts could be, thus, easily repudiated if they fell on infertile or inhospitable ground, and even the individual whence these suggestions emanated could hardly be held responsible for thinking aloud. All of these suggestions followed a similar pattern. One, a reflection on the great crisis which the Commonwealth survived in 1940–1942, to an indication that this crisis required some reorganization of the Commonwealth in order to avoid its repetition. 3. A passage of high praise for the existing structure of the Commonwealth and an emphatic statement that the independence and autonomy of its various members is close to the Speaker's heart and that nothing he suggests must be taken as implying any desire to infringe in the slightest degree on that independence. And for the suggestion itself emerges the logical incompatibility of the 4 sections of the pattern is never mentioned, and if pointed out by some critic would undoubtedly be excused on the grounds that the English are practical rather than logical, an excuse behind which many English, even outside the Milner group, frequently find refuge. We shall give 3 examples of the Milner Group's suggestions for Commonwealth reform in the second half of the recent war. They emanated from General Smuts, Lord Halifax, and Sir Edward Grey. All of them were convinced that the British Commonwealth would be drastically weaker in the post-war world and would require internal reorganization in order to take its place as a balancing force between the two great powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Smuts, in an article in the American weekly magazine Life for December 28, 1942, and in the speech before the United Kingdom branch of the Empire Parliamentary Association in London on November 25, 1943, was deliberately vague but hoped to use the close link between the United Kingdom and the dependent colonies as a means of bringing the self-governing dominions closer to the United Kingdom by combining the dominions with the colonies in regional blocks. This plan had definite advantages, although it had been rejected as impractical by Lionel Curtis in 1916. If regional blocks could be formed by dividing the British Commonwealth into 4 or 5 geographic groupings, with a dominion in each region closely associated with the colonies in the same region, and if this could be done without weakening the link between the United Kingdom and the colonies, it would serve to strengthen the link between the United Kingdom and the Dominions. This latter goal was frankly omitted by Smuts. He also suggested that a federated Western Europe be included in the United Kingdom regional bloc. Sir Edward Grigg's suggestion, made in his book The British Commonwealth, appeared also in 1943. It was very similar to Smuts's, even to the use of the same verbal expressions. For example, both spoke of the necessity for ending the dual empire, of which one part was following a centralizing course and the other a decentralizing course. This expression was derived from Lord Milner and was attributed to this source by Sir Edward and referred to the difference between the dependent and the self-governing portions of the Commonwealth. Sir Edward advocated creation of 5 regional blocks, with Western Europe associated by means of a military alliance with the United Kingdom, in one, without any sacrifice of sovereignty by anyone. He visualized the creation of a regional council like a miniature imperial conference and a joint parliamentary assembly in 3 of these regions. The members of the council would be representatives of legislatures and not of governments. The assembly would consist of select members from the existing national parliaments in proper ratio, and each region would have a permanent secretariat to carry out agreed decisions. How this elaborate organization could be reconciled with the continuance of unrestricted national sovereignty was not indicated. Lord Halifax's suggestion, made in a speech before the Toronto Board of Trade on January 24, 1944, was somewhat different, although he clearly had the same goal in view and the same mental picture of existing world conditions. He suggested that Britain could not maintain her position as a great power, in the sense in which the United States and Russia were great powers, on the basis of the strength of the United Kingdom alone. Accordingly, he advocated the creation of some method of coordination of foreign policy and measures of defense by which the Dominions could participate in both and the united front could be offered to other powers. That these trial balloons of Smuts, Grigg, and Halifax were not their isolated personal reactions but were the results of a turmoil of thought within the Milner Group was evident from the simultaneous suggestions which appeared in the Times editorials during the first week in December 1943 and the issue of the Round Table for the same month. The Winnipeg Free Press, the paper which has frequently shown knowledge of the existence of the Milner Group, in editorials of 26 and January 29, 1944, pointed out this effusion of suggestions for a reconstruction of the empire and said, added to the record of earlier statements, the Halifax speech affords conclusive evidence that there is a powerful movement on foot in the United Kingdom for a Commonwealth which will speak with a single voice. And it will be noted that Lord Halifax believes that this change in the structure of the Commonwealth will be the first consideration of the next Imperial Conference. Running through all these speeches and articles is the clear note of fear. The spokesmen are obsessed by the thought of power as being the only force that counts. The world is to be governed by Leviathans. It is tragic that the sincere and powerful group of public men in England, represented by Lord Halifax and Field Marshal Smuts, should react to the problem of maintaining peace in this way. These suggestions were met by an uproar of protests that reached unnecessary heights of denunciation, especially in Canada. They were rejected in South Africa, repulsed by Mackenzie King and others in Canada, called isolationist by the CRCF party, censured unanimously by the Quebec Assembly, and repudiated by Prime Minister Churchill. Except in New Zealand and Australia, where fear of Japan was having a profound effect on public opinion, and in the United Kingdom, where the Milner Group's influence was so extensive, the suggestions received a cold reception. In South Africa only the Cape Times was favourable, and in Canada the Vancouver province led a small band of supporters. As a result, the Milner Group once again rejected any movement toward closer union. It continued to toy with Grigg's idea of regional blocs within the Commonwealth, but here it found an almost insoluble problem. If a regional bloc were to be created in Africa, the natives of the African colonial areas would be exposed to the tender mercies of the South African Boers, and it would be necessary to repudiate the promises of native welfare which the group had supported in the Carroll White Paper of 1923. Its resistance to Boer influence in the three native protectorates in South Africa, the implications in favour of native welfare in the African Survey of 1938, and the frequent pronouncements of the Round Table on the paramount importance of protecting native rights. Such a repudiation was highly unlikely, and indeed was specifically rejected by Grigg himself in his book. For the Milner Group itself had been one of the chief, if not the chief, forces in Britain intensifying the decentralizing influences in the self-governing portions of the empire. This influence was most significant in regard to India, Palestine, Ireland, and Egypt, each of which was separated from Great Britain by a process in which the Milner Group was a principal agent. The first of these is so significant that it will be discussed in a separate chapter. but a few words should be said about the other three here. The Milner Group had relatively little to do with the affairs of Palestine except in the early period 1915 to 1919, in the later period the Peel Report of 1937, and in the fact that the British influence on the Permanent Mandates Commission was always exercised through a member of the group. The idea of establishing a mandate system for the territories taken from enemy powers as a result of the war undoubtedly arose from the Milner Group's inner circle. It was first suggested by George Louis Beer in a report submitted to the United States government on January 1, 1918. And by Lionel Curtis in an article called Windows of Freedom in the Round Table for December 1918. Beer was a member of the Round Table Group from about 1912 and was, in fact, the first member who was not a British subject. That Beer was a member of the group was revealed in the obituary published in the Round Table for September 1920. The group's attention was first attracted to Beer by a series of Anglophile studies on the British Empire in the 18th century which he published in the period after 1893. A Germanophobe as well as an Anglophile, he intended by writing, if we are to believe the Round Table, to counteract the falsehoods about British colonial policy to be found in the manuals used in American primary schools. When the Round Table Group, about 1911, began to study the causes of the American Revolution, they wrote to Beer, and thus began a close and sympathetic relationship. He wrote the reports on the United States in the Round Table for many years, and his influence is clearly evident in Curtis's The Commonwealth of Nations. He gave a hint of the existence of the Milner Group in an article which he wrote for the Political Science Quarterly of June 1915 on Milner. He said, "He stands forth as the intellectual leader of the most progressive school of imperial thought throughout the empire." Beer was one of the chief supporters of American intervention in the war against Germany in the period 1914 to 1917. He was the chief expert on colonial questions on Colonel House's inquiry, which was studying plans for the peace settlements, and he was the American expert on colonial questions at the Peace Conference in Paris. The Milner Group was able to have him named head of the Mandate Department of the League of Nations as soon as it was established. He was one of the originators of the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London and its American branch, the Council on Foreign Relations. With Lord Eustace Percy, he drew up the plan for the history of the Peace Conference which was carried out by Carroll temporarily. Curtis's suggestion for a mandates system was published in the Round Table after discussions with Carroll and other members of the Inner Circle. It was read by Smuts before it was printed and was used by the latter as the basis for his memorandum published in December 1918 with the title The League of Nations, a practical suggestion. This embodied the Constitution for the League of Nations in 21 articles. The first 9 of these dealt with the question of mandates. The Mandates Article of the Final Covenant of the League Article 22 was drafted by Smuts and Kerr according to Temperley and was introduced by Smuts to the League Commission of the Peace Conference. The mandates themselves were granted under conditions drawn up by Lord Milner. Since it was felt that this should be done on an international basis, the Milner drafts were not accepted at once but were submitted to an international committee of 5 members meeting in London. On this committee Milner was chairman and sole British member and succeeded in having his drafts accepted. 5. The execution of the terms of the mandates were under the supervision of a permanent mandates commission of 9 members, later 10. The British member of this commission was always of the Milner Group, as can be seen from the following list. W.G.A. Ormsby Gort, February-July 1921–1923. Lord Lugard, July 1923–1936. Lord Haley, September-March 1936–1939. Lord Hankey, May-September 1939–1939. Lord Haley, September 1939. The origins and the supervision power of the mandates system were thus largely the result of the activities of the Milner Group. This applied to Palestine as well as the other mandates. Palestine, however, had a peculiar position among mandates because of the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which states that Britain would regard with favour the establishment of a national home for the Jews in Palestine. This declaration, which is always known as the Balfour Declaration, should rather be called the Milner Declaration, since Milner was the actual draftsman and was, apparently, its chief supporter in the War Cabinet. This fact was not made public until July 21, 1937. At that time Ormsby Gort, speaking for the government in Commons, said, "The draft as originally put up by Lord Balfour was not the final draft approved by the War Cabinet. The particular draft assented to by the War Cabinet and afterwards by the Allied governments and by the United States, and finally embodied in the mandate, happens to have been drafted by Lord Milner. The actual final draft had to be issued in the name of the Foreign Secretary, but the actual draftsman was Lord Milner." Milner had referred to this fact in a typically indirect and modest fashion in the House of Lords on June 27, 1923, when he said, "I was a party to the Balfour Declaration." In the War Cabinet, at the time, he received strong support from General Smuts. Once the mandate was set up, also in terms drafted by Milner, the Milner Group took little actual part in the administration of Palestine. None of the various High Commissioners was a member of the group, and none of the various commissions concerned with this problem possessed a member from the group until the Peel Commission of 1936. Reginald Coupland was one of the 6 members of the Peel Commission and, according to unofficial information, was the chief author of its report. In spite of this lack of direct contact with the subject, the Milner Group exercised a certain amount of influence in regard to Palestine because of its general power in the councils of the Conservative Party and because Palestine was administered through the Colonial Office, where the Milner Group's influence was considerable. The general attitude of the Milner Group was neither pro-Arab nor pro-Zionist, although tending, if at all, toward the latter rather than the former. The group were never anti-Semitic, and not the shred of evidence in this direction has been found. In fact, they were very sympathetic to the Jews and to their legitimate aspirations to overcome their fate, but this feeling, it must be confessed, was rather general and remote, and they did not, in their personal lives, have much real contact with Jews or any real appreciation of the finer qualities of those people. Their feeling against anti-Semitism was, on the whole, remote and academic. On the other hand, as with most upper-class English, their feeling for the Arabs was somewhat more personal. Many members of the group had been in Arab countries, found their personal relationships with the Arabs enjoyable, and were attracted to them. However, this attraction of the Arabs never inclined the Milner Group toward that pro-Arab romanticism that was to be found in people like W. S. Blunt or T. B. Lawrence. The reluctance of the Milner Group to push the Zionist cause in Palestine was based on more academic considerations, chiefly two in number. 1. The feeling that it would not be fair to allow the bustling minority of Zionists to come into Palestine and drive the Arabs either out or into an inferior economic and social position, and 2. The feeling that to do this would have the effect of alienating the Arabs from Western, and especially British, culture, and that this would be especially likely to occur if the Jews obtained control of the Mediterranean coast from Egypt to Syria. Strangely enough, there is little evidence that the Milner Group was activated by strategic or economic considerations at all. Thus the widely disseminated charges that Britain failed to support Zionism in Palestine because of anti-Semitism or strategic and economic considerations is not supported by any evidence found within the Milner Group. This may be true of other sections of British public opinion, and certainly is true of the British Labour Party, where the existence of anti-Semitism as an influence seems clearly established. In Palestine, as in India and probably in Ireland, the policy of the Milner Group seems to have been motivated by good intentions which alienated the contending parties, encouraged extremism, and weakened British influence with both. In the long run, this policy was pro-Arab, just as in India it was pro-Muslim, and in both cases it served to encourage an uncompromising obstructionism which could have been avoided if Britain had merely applied the principles to which she stood committed. The attitude of the Milner Group toward the Arabs and Jews can be seen from some quotations from members of the group. At the Peace Conference of 1919, discussing the relative merits of the Jews and Arabs, Smuts said, "They haven't the Arabs' attractive manners. They do not warm the heart by graceful subjection. They make demands. They are a bitter, recalcitrant little people, and, like the Boers, impatient of leadership and ruinously quarrelsome among themselves. They see God in the shape of an Oriental potentate." A few years later, John Duff, in a letter to Brand, asked himself why there was so much pro Arab feeling among the British, especially the public school caste, and attributed it to the Arabs' good manners, derived from desert life, and their love for sports, especially riding and shooting, both close to the heart of the public school boy. A little later, in another letter, also written from Palestine, Doug declared that the whole Arab world should be in one state and it must have Syria and Palestine for its front door, not be like South Africa, with Delagoa Bay in other hands. The Arab world, he explained, needs this western door because we are trying to westernize the Arabs, and without it they would be driven to the east and to India, which they hate. He concluded, if the Arab belongs to the Mediterranean, as T. Lawrence insists, we should do nothing to stop him getting back to it. Why our own nostrum for the ills of mankind everywhere is Western civilization, and, if it is a sound one, what would be the good of forcing the people who want direct contact with us to slink in and out of their country by a back door which, like the Persian Gulf, opens only on the east? It would certainly check development, if it did not actually warp it. I suggest then that partition should not be permanent, but this does not mean that a stage of friendly tutelage is necessarily a bad thing for the Arabs. On the contrary, advanced peoples can give so much to stimulate backward ones if they do it with judgment and sympathy. Above all, it must not be the kind of help which kills individuality. Personally, I don't see the slightest harm in Jews coming to Palestine under reasonable conditions. They are the Arabs' cousins as much as the Phoenicians, and if Zionism brings capital and labor which will enable industries to start, it will add to the strength of the larger unit which someday is going to include Palestine. But they must be content to be part of such a potential unit. They need have no fear of absorption, for they have everything to gain from an Arab federation. It would mean a far larger field for their activities. The attitude of the Milner Group toward the specific problem of Zionism was expressed in explicit terms by Lord Milner himself in a speech in the House of Lords on June 27, 1923. After expressing his wholehearted agreement with the policy of the British government as revealed in its actions and in its statements, like the Balfour Declaration and the White Paper of 1922 CMD 1700, he added, I am not speaking of the policy which is advocated by the extreme Zionists, which is a totally different thing. I believe that we have only to go on steadily with the policy of the Balfour Declaration as we have ourselves interpreted it in order to see great material progress in Palestine and a gradual subsistence of the present Arab agitation, the force of which it would be foolish to deny, but which I believe to be largely due to artificial stimulus and, to a very great extent, to be excited from without. The symptoms of any real and general dissatisfaction among the mass of the Arab population with the conditions under which they live, I think it would be very difficult to discover. There is plenty of room in that country for a considerable immigrant population without injuring in any way the resident Arab population, and, indeed, in many ways it would tend to their extreme benefit. There are about 700,000 people in Palestine, and there is room for several millions. I am and always have been a strong supporter of the pro-Arab policy which was first advocated in this country in the course of the war. I believe in the independence of the Arab countries, which they owe to us and which they can only maintain with our help. I look forward to an Arab Federation. I am convinced that the Arab will make a great mistake in claiming Palestine as a part of the Arab Federation in the same sense as are the other countries of the Near East which are mainly inhabited by Arabs. He then went on to say that he felt that Palestine would require a permanent mandate and under that condition could become the national home for the Jews, could take as many Jewish immigrants as the country could economically support, but must never become the Jewish state. This was the point of view of the Milner Group, and it remained the point of view of the British government until 1939. Like the Milner Group's point of view on other issues, it was essentially fair, compromising, and well-intentioned. It broke down in Palestine because of the obstructionism of the Arabs, the intention of the Zionists to have political control of their national home, if they got one, the pressure on both Jews and Arabs from the World Depression after 1929, and the need for a refuge from Hitler. For European Jews after 1933, the Milner Group did not approve of the efforts of the Labour government in 1929 to 1931 to curtail Zionist rights in Palestine. They protested vigorously against the famous White Paper of 1930 CMD 3692, which was regarded as anti-Zionist. Baldwin, Austin Chamberlain, and Leopold Amory protested against the document in a letter to the Times on October 30, 1930. Smuts sent a telegram of protest to the Prime Minister, and Sir John Simon declared it a violation of the mandate in a letter to the Times. 7 years later, the report of the Peel Commission said that the White Paper betrayed the marked insensitiveness to Jewish feelings. As a result of this pressure, Ramsay MacDonald wrote a letter to Dr. Weizmann, interpreting the document in a more moderate fashion. As might be expected, in view of the position of Reginald Coupland on the Peel Commission, the report of that commission met with the most enthusiastic reception from the Milner Group. This report was a scholarly study of conditions in Palestine, of a type usually found in any document with which the Milner Group had direct contact. For the first time in any government document, the aspirations of Jews and Arabs in Palestine were declared to be irreconcilable and the existing mandate unworkable. Accordingly, the report recommended the partition of Palestine into a Jewish state, an Arab state, and a neutral enclave containing the holy places. This suggestion was accepted by the British government in a White Paper CMD 5513 issued through Ormsby Gort. He also defended it before the Permanent Mandates Commission of the League of Nations. In the House of Lords it was defended by Lord Lugard, but recently retired as the British member of the Permanent Mandates Commission. It was also supported by Lord Dufferin and Archbishop Lang. In the House of Commons, the motion to approve the government's policy as outlined in the White Paper CMD 5513 was introduced by Ormsby Gore. The first speech in support of the motion, which was passed without a division, was from Leopold Amory. Amory's speech in support of this motion is extremely interesting and is actually an evolution, under the pressure of hard facts, from the point of view described by Lord Milner in 1923. Amory said, "However much we may regret it, we have lost the situation in Palestine, as we lost it in Ireland, through a lack of wholehearted faith in ourselves and through the constitutional inability of the individual Briton, and indeed of the country as a whole, not to see the other fellow's point of view and to be influenced by it, even to the detriment of any consistent policy." According to Amory, the idea of partition occurred to the Peel Commission only after it had left Palestine and the report was already written. Thus the Commission was unable to hear any direct evidence on this question or make any examination of how partition should be carried out in detail. He said, "Of the 396 pages of the report, almost the whole of the first 368 pages, including the whole of chapters 7 to 19, represent an earlier report of an entirely different character. That earlier report envisaged the continuation of the mandate in its present form. Throughout all these chapters to which I have referred, the whole text of the chapters deals with the assumption that the mandate is continued, but here and there, at the end of some chapter, there is tacked on in a quite obviously added last paragraph, something to this effect: all the rest of the chapters before it something that might have been considered if, as a matter of fact, we were not going to pursue an entirely different policy." These last paragraphs were obviously added by the Secretary, or whoever helped draft the report, after the main great conclusion was reached at a very late stage. Since the Milner Group supported partition in Palestine, as they had earlier in Ireland and as they did later in India, it is not too much to believe that Copeland added the additional paragraphs after the Commission had returned to England and he had had an opportunity to discuss the matter with other members of the inner circle. In fact, Amory's remarks were probably based on knowledge rather than internal textual evidence and were aimed to get the motion accepted, with the understanding that it approved no more than the principle of partition, with the details to be examined by another commission later. This, in fact, is what was done. Amory's speech is also interesting for its friendly reference to the Jews. He said that in the past the Arabs had obtained 100% of what they were promised, while the Jews had received a raw deal, in spite of the fact that the Jews had a much greater need of the country and would make the best use of the land. To carry out the policy of partition, the government appointed a new Royal Commission of 4 members in March 1938, known as the Woodhead Commission. This body had no members of either the Milner Group or the Cecil Block on it, and its report CMD 58-54 rejected partition as impractical on the grounds that any acceptable method of partition into two states would give a Jewish state with an annual financial surplus and an Arab state with an annual financial deficit. This conclusion was accepted by the government in another white paper, CMD 5893 of 1938. As an alternative, the government called a round-table conference of Jews and Arabs from Palestine along with representatives of the Arab states outside of Palestine. During all this, the Arabs had been growing increasingly violent. They refused to accept the Peel report. They boycotted the Woodhead Commission, and they finally broke into open civil war. In such conditions, nothing was accomplished at the Round Table meetings at London in February-March 1939. The Arab delegation included leaders who had to be released from prison in order to come and who refused to sit in the same conference with the Jews. Compromise proposals presented by the government were rejected by both sides. After the conference broke up, the government issued a new Statement of Policy, CMD 60-19 of May 1939. It was a drastic reversal of previous statements and was obviously a turn in favor of the Arabs. It fixed Jewish immigration into Palestine at 75,000 for the whole of the next 5 years, including illegal immigration, and gave the Arabs a veto on any Jewish immigration after the 5-year period was finished. As a matter of principle, it shifted the basis for Jewish immigration from the older criterion of the economic absorptive capacity of Palestine to the political absorptive capacity. This was really an invitation to the Arabs to intensify their agitation and constituted a vital blow at the Jews, since it was generally conceded that Jewish immigration increased the economic absorptive capacity for both Jews and Arabs. The Miltner Group were divided on this concrete policy. In general, they continued to believe that the proper solution to the Zionist problem could be found in a partitioned Palestine within a federation of Arab states. The Round Table offered this as its program in March 1939 and repeated it in June of the same year. But on the issue of an immediate and concrete policy, the group was split. It is highly unlikely that this split originated with the issue of Zionism. It was, rather, the reflection of the more fundamental split within the group, between those, like Amory and Salter, who abandoned the appeasement policy in March 1939, and those, like the Astors and Lothian, who continued to pursue it in a modified form. The change in the policy of the government resulted in a full debate in the House of Commons. This debate, and the resulting division, revealed the split within the Miltner Group. The policy of the White Paper was denounced by Amory as a betrayal of the Jews and of a mandate, as the final step in a scaling down of Jewish hopes that began in 1922, as a yielding of principle to Arab terrorists, as invalid without the approval of the League of Nations, and as unworkable because the Jews would and could resist it. The speeches for the government from Malcolm MacDonald and R.A. Butler were weak and vague. In the division, the government won approval of the White Paper by 268 to 179. with Major Astor, Nancy Astor, Horace Simon, Malcolm MacDonald, and Sir Donald Somerville in the majority, and Amory, Noel Baker, and Arthur Salter in the minority. On the same day, a similar motion in the House of Lords was approved without a division. The government at once began to put the white paper policy into effect, without waiting for the approval of the Permanent Mandates Commission. In July 1939, rumors began to circulate that this body had disapproved of the policy, and questions were asked in the House of Commons. But MacDonald evaded the issue, refused to give information which he possessed, and announced that the government would take the issue to the Council of the League. As the council meeting was cancelled by the outbreak of war, this could not be done, but within a week of the announcement the minutes of the Permanent Mandates Commission were released. They showed that the Commission had, by unanimous vote, decided that the policy of the White Paper was contrary to the accepted interpretations of the mandate, and, by a vote of 4-3, that the White Paper was inconsistent with the mandate under any possible interpretation. In this last vote, Hankey, at his first session of the Commission, voted in the minority. As a result of the release of this information, a considerable section of the House was disturbed by the government's high-handed actions and by the Colonial Secretary's evasive answers in July 1939. In March 1940, Noel Baker introduced a motion of censure on this issue. The motion did not go to a division, but Amory once again objected to the new policy and to inviting representatives of the Arab states to the abortive Round Table Conference of 1939. He called the presence of agents of the Mufti and the Round Table surrender. By this time the Milner Group was badly shattered on other issues than Palestine. Within 2 months of this debate, it was reunited on the issue of all-out war against Germany, and Amory had resumed a seat in the cabinet as Secretary of State for India. The Palestine issue declined in importance and did not revive to any extent until the Labour government of 1945 had taken office. From that time on, the members of the Milner Group were united again on the issue, objecting to the Labour government's anti-Jewish policy and generally following the line Amory had laid down in 1939. In fact, it was Amory who did much of the talking in 1946 to 1949. But this is not strictly part of our story. In Irish affairs, the Milner Group played a much more decisive role than in Palestine affairs, although only for the brief period from 1917 to 1925. Previous to 1917 and going back to 1887, Irish affairs had been one of the most immediate concerns of the Cecil bloc. A nephew of Lord Salisbury was Chief Secretary for Ireland in 1887 to 1891, another nephew held the post in 1895 to 1900, and the private secretary and protégé of the former held the post in 1900 to 1905. The Cecil bloc had always been opposed to Home Rule for Ireland, and when, in 1912 to 1914, the Liberal government took steps to grant Home Rule, Sir Edward Carson took the lead in opposing these steps. Carson was a creation of the Cecil bloc, a fact admitted by Balfour in 1929, when he told his niece, "I made Carson." Balfour found Carson a simple Dublin barrister in 1887, when he went to Ireland as Chief Secretary. He made Carson one of his chief prosecuting attorneys in 1887, an MP for Dublin University in 1892, and Solicitor General in his own government in 1900 to 1906. When the Home Rule Bill of 1914 was about to pass, Carson organized a private army, known as the Ulster Volunteers, armed them with guns smuggled in from Germany, and formed a plot to seize control of Belfast at a given signal from him. This signal, in the form of a code telegram, was written in 1914 and on its way to be dispatched by Carson when he received word from Asquith that war with Germany was inevitable. Accordingly, the revolt was cancelled and the date on which the Home Rule Bill was to go into effect was postponed by special Act of Parliament until 6 months after peace should be signed. The information about the telegram of 1914 was revealed to Lionel Curtis by Carson in a personal conversation after war began. Curtis's attitude was quite different, and he thoroughly disapproved of Carson's plot. This difference is an indication of a difference in point of view in regard to Ireland between the Milner Group and the Cecil bloc. The latter was willing to oppose Home Rule even to the point where it would condone illegal actions. The former, on the contrary, was in favour of Home Rule because it believed that Ireland would aid Britain's enemies in every crisis and leave the Commonwealth at the first opportunity unless it were given freedom to govern itself. The Milner Group's attitude toward the Irish question was expressed by the Round Table in a retrospective article in the September 1935 issue in the following words: "The root principle of the Round Table remained freedom, the government of men by themselves, and it demanded that within the empire, this principle should be persistently pursued and expressed in institutions." For that reason it denounced the post-war attempt to repress the Irish demand for national self-government by ruthless violence after a century of union had failed to win Irish consent, as a policy in conflict with British institutions and inconsistent with the principle of the British Commonwealth, and it played its part in achieving the Irish Treaty and the Dominion Settlement. The part which the group played in the Irish settlement was considerably more than this brief passage might indicate, but it could not take effect until the group in Britain advocating repression and the group in Ireland advocating separation from the Crown had brought each other to some realization of the advantages of compromise. These advantages were pointed out by the group, especially by Lionel Curtis, who began the 2-year term as editor of the Round Table immediately after his great triumph in the Government of India Act of 1919. In the March 1920 issue, for example, he discussed and approved a project, first announced by Lloyd George in December 1919, to separate Northern and Southern Ireland and give self-government to both as autonomous parts of Great Britain. This was really nothing but an application of the principle of devolution, whose attractiveness to the Milner Group has already been mentioned. The Irish settlement in the period 1920 to 1923 is very largely a Milner Group achievement. For most of this period, Amory's brother-in-law, Mark Greenwood, Viscount Greenwood since 1937, was Chief Secretary for Ireland. He was, indeed, the last person to hold this office before it was abolished at the end of 1922. Curtis was advisor on Irish affairs to the Colonial Office in 1921 to 1924, and Smuts and Feetham intervened in the affair at certain points. A settlement of the Irish problem along lines similar to those advocated by the Round Table was enacted in the Government of Ireland Act of December 1920. Drafted by H.A.L. Fisher and piloted through Commons by him, it passed the critical second reading by a vote of 348 to 94. In the majority were Amory, Nancy Astor, Austin Chamberlain, H.A.L. Fisher, Mark Greenwood, Samuel Hoare, G.R. Lane Fox, brother-in-law of Lord Halifax, and E.F. Elwood, Lord Halifax. In the minority were Lord Robert Cecil and Lord Walter, son of Lord Selborne. In the House of Lords the bill passed by 164 to 75. In the majority were Lords Curzon, Lytton, Onslow, brother-in-law of Lord Halifax, Goshen, Hampden, brother of Robert Brand Hardinge, Milner, Despot, Ruff, Gurney, Meston, Monson, Finley Moore, Riedel, and Themis. In the minority were Lords Linlithgow, Beauchamp, father-in-law of Samuel Hoare Midlyton, Bryce, Hampfield, brother-in-law of Samuel Hoare, and Leconfield, brother of Hugh Wyndham. The Act of 1920 never went into effect because the extremists on both sides were not yet satiated with blood. By June 1921 they were. The first movement in this direction, according to W. K. Hancock, may be said to open as early as October 1920, when the Times published suggestions for a truce and negotiations between plenipotentiaries of both sides. The same authority lists 10 voices as being raised in protest at British methods of repression. 3 of these were of the Milner Group: the Times, the Round Table, and Sir John Simon. He quotes the Round Table as saying, "If the British Commonwealth can only be preserved by such means, it would become the negation of the principle for which it has stood." 6 similar arguments were brought to bear on the Irish leaders by January Smuts. Smuts left South Africa for England at the end of May 1921, to attend the Imperial Conference of that year, which was to open on a Monday. He arrived in England the preceding Saturday and went to Oxford to stay with friends of the Milner Group. In the evening he attended the Rhodes dinner, which means he saw more of the group. The following day, he was called by the King to Windsor Castle and went immediately. The King told Smuts that he was going to make a speech at the opening of the new Ulster Parliament. He asked Smuts to write down suggestions for this speech. Smuts stayed the night at Windsor Castle, drafted a speech, and gave it to the King's private secretary. The sequel can best be told in Smuts's own words as recorded in the second volume of S. G. Millen's biography. The next day Lloyd George invited me to attend a committee meeting of the Cabinet, to give my opinion of the King's speech. And what should this King's speech turn out to be but a typewritten copy of the draft I had myself written the night before. I found them working on it. Nothing was said about my being the author. They innocently consulted me and I innocently answered them. But imagine the interesting position. Well, they toned the thing down a bit. They made a few minor alterations. But in substance the speech the King delivered next week in Belfast was the one I prepared. 7. Needless to say, this speech was conciliatory. Shortly afterward, Tom Casement, brother of Sir Roger Casement, who had been executed by the British in 1916, opened negotiations between Smuts and the Irish leaders in Dublin. Tom Casement was an old friend of Smuts, for he had been British consul at Delagoa Bay in 1914 and served with Smuts in East Africa in 1916 to 1917. As a result, Smuts went to Ireland in June 1921 under an alias and was taken to the hiding place of the rebels. He tried to persuade them that they would be much better off with dominion status within the British Commonwealth than as a republic, offering as an example the insecure position of the Transvaal before 1895 in contrast with its happy condition after 1909. He said in conclusion, "Make no mistake about it. You have more privilege, more power, more peace, more security in such a sisterhood of equal nations than in a small, nervous republic having all the time to rely on goodwill, and perhaps the assistance, of foreigners. What sort of independence do you call that? By comparison with real independence it is a shadow. You sell the fact for the name." Smuts felt that his argument was having an effect on Arthur Griffith and some others, but de Vogler remained suspicious, and Erskine Childers was positively hostile. Nevertheless, the Irish decided to open negotiations with London, and Smuts promised to arrange an armistice. The armistice went into effect on July 11, 1921, and 3 days later the conference began. The Irish Conference of 1921 was held in 2 sessions, a week in July and a series of meetings from 1 October 1 to December 6, 1921. The secretary to the conference was Lionel Curtis, who resigned his editorship of the Round Table for the purpose and remained as chief advisor on Irish affairs to the Colonial Office for the next 3 years. As a result of the conference, the Irish moderates negotiated the Articles of Agreement of December 6, 1921. De Vogler had refused to form part of the Irish delegation at the second session of the conference, and refused to accept Dominion status, although Smuts begged him to do so in the letter published in the Times on August 15. As a result of the Articles of Agreement of December 1921 and the Irish Free State Act of March 1922, Southern Ireland became an independent dominion within the British Commonwealth. Its boundary with Northern Ireland was to be settled by a boundary commission of 3 members representing the 3 interested parties. On this commission, Richard Feetham of the Milner Group was the British member and also chairman. The subsequent revolt of de Vogler and the Irish Republicans against the Free State government, and the ultimate victory of their ideas, is not part of our story. It was a development which the Milner Group were powerless to prevent. They continued to believe that the Irish, like others, could be bound to Britain by invisible ties if all visible ones were destroyed. This extraordinary belief, admirable as it was, had its basis in a profoundly Christian outlook and, like appeasement of Hitler, self-government for India, or the Statute of Westminster, had its ultimate roots in the Sermon on the Mount. Unfortunately, such Christian tactics were acutely dangerous in a non-Christian world, and in this respect the Irish were only moderately different from Hitler. The Milner Group's reward for their concessions to Ireland was not to be obtained in this world. This became clear during the Second World War, when the inability of the British to use Irish naval bases against German submarines had fatal consequences for many gallant British seamen. These bases had been retained for Britain as a result of the agreement of 1922 but were surrendered to the Irish on April 25, 1938, just when Hitler's threat to Britain was becoming acute. The Round Table of June 1938 welcomed this surrender, saying, "The defence of the Irish coast, as John Redmond vainly urged in 1914, should be primarily a matter for Irishmen." As the official links between Eyre and Britain were slowly severed, the crew made every effort to continue unofficial relationships such as those through the Irish Institute of International Affairs and the unofficial British Commonwealth Relations Conference, which had Irish members in 1938. The relationships of Britain with Egypt were also affected by the activity of the Milner Group. The details need not detain us long. It is sufficient to state that the Egyptian Declaration of 1922 was a result of the personal negotiations of Lord Milner in Egypt in his capacity as Colonial Secretary. In this post his permanent Under-Secretary was Sir George Fitz of the Kindergarten, his parliamentary Under-Secretary was Hamri, and his chief advisor in Egypt was M.S. Walron, also of the Kindergarten. Without going into the very extensive influence which members of the Milner Group have had on other parts of the Commonwealth, especially tropical Africa, it must be clear that, however unsatisfactory Commonwealth relations may be to the group now, they nevertheless were among the chief creators of the existing system. This will appear even more clearly when we examine their influence in the history of India.